Okay, so we just saw the use of this piece of called an input box that was here. Right, we had input box, and notice it has parentheses around it, and so that means it's a kind of action, or we called it a method. It's also called a function, and like mathematical functions, it takes an argument, and it took this argument, which was a string. Okay, and it used that argument to write something on the input box that the user sees. So what is a function? So input box is a special Visual Basic keyword known as a function. So not only is it it's a keyword, that means it's a reserved word like if or and or end rather, and so on, sub, and so on. It's a keyword, but it's also a special kind of keyword. It's a particular type of keyword, and it's called a function. A function is a statement that performs work or meaningful work. In this case, what does it do? It prompts the user for information, right? That's what it does. It prompts the user for information. Or it might calculate an equation and then returns a result to the program. So this function, the input box, prompts the user for information and then returns that information into a variable. That's what we saw here. It takes whatever the user supplied. First of all, the function takes an argument, but that just shows up on the input box screen. And then the user enters a response, and the response goes into here. So the value returned by a function can be assigned to a variable, which is what we did. The value that was returned was the input of the user, and that can be assigned to a variable, as it was in the input box program. Or it can be assigned to a property, so it doesn't have to go to a variable. We could just assign it to a property. Like we could have directly, actually we didn't need to use this full name variable. We could have just said input box prompt and put that here. Could have put it here, like this. And that would have worked just as well. But I don't want to do that. So I'll leave it like that. So so it can be assigned to a property or another statement, or it could even the output from one function, like from the input box function, might be the input to another function. Anyway, Visual Basic functions often use one or more arguments to define their activities. So we saw in this example for the input box function, we had just one argument. For example, the input box function you just executed used the prompt variable to display dialog box instructions to the user. When a function uses more than one argument, commas separate the arguments, and the whole group of arguments is enclosed in the parentheses. So here, it looks like actually the input box could have taken two arguments. Okay? It looks like it could have taken two arguments separated by a comma. So the title we also could have changed. In fact, let's try and see what happens if we do that. So suppose I change it from before we just had prompt in here. Suppose I put a comma there and a second argument. Let's see if it does anything with this, or if it complains. Okay, it didn't complain. It didn't give me an error. Now let's see what happens. Okay, so apparently this second index here, second argument here goes up here. Okay, so what you put in a second argument will show up here. Okay, so actually the input box can take one argument or it can take two arguments. Okay, so that's the idea of a function. Now he makes an additional note here. He says he's using italics here, and italics in this syntax description to indicate that certain items are placeholders for information that you specify. So when you see italics, it means that it's information that you would specify in there. So prompt and title have to be given values by us, the programmer. Okay, let's introduce a new function called the message box function. So this is another function, and let's see what it does. So I just added this new line of code here at the very beginning. So let's see what it does. So when I run the form, what happens? So I run the form, and then this code, remember, is in the input box event handler. So if I click on the input box, let's see what happens. Before, it brought up the prompt. It said input box and APU input and so on. Let's see what happens now though, because this code comes before all the other code. Okay, so it brings up this. This is called a message box, and it just displays whatever I put in there. Okay, after I click OK, then then the next step is to bring up the input box. Okay, so this is a new function called the message box. Okay, now probably you're familiar in mathematics where we do something like this. We take f is one function, and instead of having f of x, we have another function inside. So g does something to x, and then that result gets fed into f. Okay, this is called, in mathematics, called function composition. So we can do the same kind of thing, even if, for functions that are programming functions. So in other words, we have, for example, an outside function like capital F might be the input box function that we first saw, and maybe, I'm sorry, the other way around. The inside function might be the input box function, and the outside might be a different function. In this case, the one that I just introduced you to, called the message box. So we're going to take the result of this. Remember, this is going to take what the user types in, and that's going to be the result of this. And then we're going to take that result and we're going to put it into the message box. So the message box will display it. So let's see how that works. So let me go back to here and get rid of this. Or maybe I'll just comment it out. Okay. Actually, before we do that, let's do one more thing. Let's explore this message box just a little bit more. Actually, just like the input box can take at least two arguments, it took two here, the message box can actually take another argument. So let's put in another argument, and let's call it input results, so it's text, and let's see how this behaves. So let's run this code and see what we get here. Remember, before it just displayed this little message that said hello. Let's see where this shows up. Okay, so let's click on this to get it going. Try again. Doesn't like it. Okay, I got an error. Okay, so this brings up an important point. Let me close the message here. By the way, when you get an error like this, you go up to the stop button. So, the green button up at the top that we've been using to run, and then there's two buttons to the right of that. There's a stop button, so you click that. You need to do that before you can continue to edit it, the code. Now to fix this error, you see that I've inserted an extra comma, which means that we have space for 3 arguments, although one of them is blank. We're doing what we would call in mathematics function composition. We're taking the results of one function, the input box function, and taking those results and feeding them into a second function, the message box function. Okay. So please try this yourself. You don't have to do it now. You'll hand it in for homework.